Okay, this is lesson 5, and we're starting in this study in chapter 12. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on his heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, that he might devour the child at the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the earth, all the nations, with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his demons, and the angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his days are short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly to a place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river and the dragon that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. We talked about the book of Revelation being a play with 2 separate acts. And Act 1, as we saw in the last lesson, Act 1 ended on a high note, and that is the announcement that God would begin destroying the destroyer who was persecuting God's people. And now the curtain opens on Act 2, and here's the scene that's described for us in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. We see a glorious woman standing on the moon. The sun is wrapped around her shoulders. She has 12 stars encircling her head. She's about to give birth. But who appears along with this woman in chapter 12? Well, we also read about the dragon. And he's a dangerous looking creature. 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on his heads. He has a tail that sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky and flings them to earth. And he's waiting for this woman to give birth so that he might devour the child that is born. And so let's talk about the identity of the dragon and the identity of the child. And we'll get to the woman here in a little bit later. But who's the dragon? Well, we know, and we've mentioned in a previous lesson, that the dragon is Satan. And we see that here in chapter 12, verse 9. And the identity of the dragon is also given to us a little bit later when we get to chapter 20. If you want to look at Revelation 20, verse 2, it says, "He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years." And so on 2 separate occasions, we're told that the dragon is Satan. And so we don't even have to guess about the identity of the dragon or what he symbolizes or who he is. We know that anytime the dragon is mentioned in Revelation, it's a reference to the devil. It's a reference to Satan. And so let's talk now about the child text. First of all, it said that he will rule the nations with an iron scepter, which is actually a direct quote from a messianic prophecy found way back in the Psalms. In fact, let's read that particular portion of Psalm 2, Psalm chapter 2, verses 7 and 9. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. Now, some versions there say with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. And so this child then in Revelation chapter 12 is snatched up to the throne of God. And we've already seen the lamb slain, who also represents Jesus, is seen and is found there at the center of the throne with God the Father. And that's where this child is taken to. He's taken to God's throne. And so it seems obvious then that the child is a reference to Jesus. And so in this particular scene, we have Satan, we have Jesus, and let's talk about the conflict that occurs. Really what we see is a war that is described and four major battles within that war. Four attacks of Satan that are described in these two chapters. Battle number one is this, and that is that Satan attacks Christ on earth. And that's evident by the fact that this dragon is just waiting to devour the child the moment that he's born. I actually preached Revelation chapter 12 at Christmas time one year, and the way that I presented it was that this is the Christmas story from heaven's perspective. And that's exactly what it is. This is describing what happened in the spiritual realm at the time that Jesus was born. And we could read the accounts in the Gospels and know what was happening in the physical realm, what was happening here on earth. But Revelation chapter 12 is giving us a picture, especially the first part of chapter 12, giving us a picture of what was happening in the heavenly realms when Jesus was born. Satan wasn't happy about Jesus being born into the world, and so he wanted to snuff out God's plan before it ever got off the ground. I remember just a few years ago, a church in very close proximity to our church building had a nativity scene out in front of their church building. And it was kind of, what was interesting about this particular nativity scene was that it had all the elements of a traditional nativity scene. You had Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus lying in the manger, and the shepherds and the angels. But on top of the manger was a huge inflatable dragon. And I had some people, even though that wasn't placed in front of our church building, I had some people ask me about it just because they were curious. They were wondering if someone had vandalized this other church and had placed that dragon on top of the manger, or if it was some type of sacrilegious message. They just didn't know. They didn't understand what all that was about. And without having spoken with the leaders of that particular church, what I suspect was that they were trying to convey what is seen here and the picture that is seen here in Revelation chapter 12. But the dragon was lurking and was wanting to destroy Jesus from the very beginning. And there's plenty of evidence that Satan was trying to snuff out God's plan at the time that Jesus was born. And what was Herod's decree when Jesus was born in Bethlehem? Well, he decreed that all babies 2 years age 2 and under in the vicinity of Bethlehem were killed. No more gruesome of an order has been given any time, anywhere in human history. That's about as evil as it gets. And there were other plots and manipulations to try and get Jesus killed. And ultimately, Jesus was killed, but not before he accomplished everything that he came to do. And so the text says that the child was snatched up to the throne of God. In other words, Satan failed in his first attempt to defeat Christ and to thwart God's plans and purposes. But there's a second battle that's described here in Revelation chapter 12, and this is the battle that's described in verses 7 through 9. So let's look one more time at those verses from Revelation chapter 12. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. And so now there's a battle in heaven that takes place in heaven. And we don't know what heavenly warfare looks like. Now, the way that it's depicted in this picture is that it almost looks like something out of The Lord of the Rings or out of a science fiction or a fantasy novel. And what do we know about Michael in Scripture? We've got this reference to the angel Michael. Well, his name means one who is like God. We know that he's mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel, and he's referred to as a prince. We know that in Jude 9, he's referred to as an archangel, the only other angel mentioned by name other than Gabriel. We know that about Michael. And so to figure out when this particular battle took place, we have to ask the question, when did Satan essentially lose his war with God? And I think we might answer that by suggesting that at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection was the time that Satan essentially, for all intents and purposes, lost the war. And verse 9 of Revelation chapter 12 says that at that time, Satan was hurled to earth, which indicates to me that Satan has no power or control over the area beyond physical death. All the power he has is limited to earth. And so think for a moment about people that we've lost, the people that have gone on and have left this life. We've lost family members. We've lost church members that were an integral part of our lives at Robinson Avenue. And we've lost people that were near and dear to us, but Satan can't touch them anymore. But he could still tempt and he could still affect our lives. And so that's where his efforts are focused. Satan has been hurled to earth, and so he could still do some damage here. But once we've departed to be with Christ, we can no longer be harmed by Satan. Satan is defeated, but he still has some power. Maybe the best analogy that I've heard of this was when I was in graduate school, and our professor spoke about the Second World War. And he asked the question, when was World War II won in Europe? Well, officially, that was VE Day that occurred in 1945. But there was a sense in which war was won on D-Day, the successful invasion of Normandy that opened the door for the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. And so, for all intents and purposes, even though the war might have been won there, that the fighting and the hostilities continued for almost a full year. And we still lost some of our young men, and soldiers were still wounded and taken down on the battlefield as the fighting continued to play itself out. Well, in a sense, Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection, that was D-Day. But the second coming, that will be VE Day. Satan has lost the war, but he's going to keep on fighting, and in the process, he's going to win some skirmishes, and he's going to win some individual battles, and he wants to take some people down with him, and that's why we have to be on our guard. He's angry. He wants to take as many people down with him as possible. Look again at Revelation 12, verses 10 through 12. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He's filled with fury, because he knows that his days are short." And just that last verse ought to just send a chill up our spine and make us shudder. Satan is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. And to us, that should say we need to be on our guard and know that yes, Jesus has secured the victory. And we have this promise of eternal life. And yet Satan wants to take as many people down with him as he possibly can, because he's angry that he's lost, and he's angry that he's ultimately going to lose. And so Satan lost round 2. Well, now he goes on to concentrate on this third battle that's described in Revelation chapter 12. And that's described in verses 13 and 16, where we read that Satan goes after the woman who has given birth to the child. And so we talked about the identity of the dragon, that's Satan. We've talked about the identity of the child, that's Jesus, that's Christ. But who does this woman represent? Well, the first idea that might come to mind is that she represents Mary. After all, Mary gave birth to Christ. This woman gives birth to the child who is Christ in Revelation chapter 12. But there are some things that don't seem to fit if we were to interpret this woman literally as being representative of Mary. It's true that Mary gave birth to Jesus, but it's hard to make sense of some of these other images of her being given wings to fly and her standing on the moon. Now, we know all this is figurative, but even still, it's hard to apply these things to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Some have suggested that this woman represents the nation of Israel. After all, Jesus, it could be said that the nation of Israel gave birth to Jesus because Jesus descended from the nation of Israel. But Israel can't really be described as the mother of Jesus when they rejected Jesus as the Messiah and engaged in some of their own persecution. And so who does this woman represent? Well, I think perhaps the best explanation is that this woman represents the eternal plan of God. Not one particular person, but instead just this idea of God's eternal plans and purposes, that is being what is represented by this woman in Revelation chapter 12. And that seems to fit all the evidence, because it was God's eternal plan that gave birth to Jesus. Look with me at Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us with all wisdom and understanding. He made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he poured out in Christ to be put into effect when times reached their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. And so God's eternal plan, in a sense, gave birth to Jesus. And God's eternal plan was something that Satan wanted to thwart. The dragon wanted to destroy the woman. The dragon wanted to destroy the child. Satan is constantly trying to thwart God's eternal plan. It can be said that God's eternal plan is what gave birth to the church, that gave birth to Christianity as a movement. And God's eternal plan has been protected in the sense that even during times of intense struggle and during times of intense persecution, God's plan is going to prevail. And no one's going to thwart God's eternal plans and purposes, no matter what happens. Well, what's the fourth battle that's described in Revelation chapter 12? Well, we see in verse 17 that the dragon goes off to make war against the woman's offspring. And so this is another reason why I think that the woman represents God's eternal plan, because there are really two fights that are described here, the dragon versus the woman and the dragon versus the offspring of the woman. Now, if you interpret the woman as being Mary, this really isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. Mary had other offspring besides Jesus later on, but they're not the ones that are referred to here. But in chapter 12, verse 17, the dragon prepares for round 4, and then chapter 13 tells us more about that fourth battle. And so basically, Satan has already lost in his first 3 attempts. He couldn't kill Jesus at the time of his birth. He thought that perhaps he had won at the time that Jesus was crucified, and yet Jesus was resurrected and proved to be victorious. Satan has tried on other occasions and at other times to thwart God's eternal plan. And so the fourth attempt is now, Satan reasons, if I could kill God's people, if I could kill all the witnesses, then there won't be anyone to testify to the gospel. And it won't matter that Jesus died and was resurrected if there's no one left to tell about it. If I could somehow persecute the church out of existence. Let's look at chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. We're going to read verses 1 through 10. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and the mouth like a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had been given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who could wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with a sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. And so Satan he's struck out 3 times already. He's tried to kill Jesus at his birth. He thought he'd won at Jesus' crucifixion. He's tried to stamp out God's eternal plan. And now he wants to mount a persecution that's so strong that the Christians will be killed. And if they're not killed, they're going to at least be forced to renounce their faith. In other words, he wants to persecute the church out of existence. And in chapter 13, verse 1, he brings up an agent to do his bidding. And we've seen this picture before. This is a beast coming out of the sea. He has 10 horns and 7 heads. He has the body of a leopard, a mouth like a lion, feet like a bear. We know that this beast blasphemes God, that he exercises authority for a 42-month period, that he makes war against the saints and conquers them, that he has great authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Everyone worships him, everyone except those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. There are some additional clues about this first beast given in chapter 17. Look with me at chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The 7 heads represent 7 hills on which sits the woman who rides the beast, and also the 7 heads represent 7 kings. 5 have been in power, 1 is, and 1 is still to come. So those are the clues, but what does all this mean? How do we interpret all this? Well, we studied this in our introductory lesson. We identified the first beast as being representative of the Roman Empire. And we've already talked about some of the reasons why. Well, in Revelation chapter 13, this political power reigns over many nations and is led by kings or emperors, and one of whom is in power at the time that John gives his revelation. And he uses that universal power to do Satan's bidding, to persecute Christians. And people all over the world worship this beast as God. The woman who rides the beast in chapter 17, she's called a great city. She sits on 7 hills. Now, it's kind of interesting that archaeologists suggest that Rome was originally established as a confederation of 7 cities built on 7 hills. Actually, here's a picture of those 7 hills along with their names. But I want you to notice a few more things about the sea beast before we start talking about the land beast. Look at chapter 13, verse 3 once more. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. What seemingly fatal wound had been inflicted upon the Roman Empire? Well, it's possible that this is a reference to the death of Nero. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68. He was the first Roman emperor to officially persecute Christians and to persecute the church. And that persecution subsided some under subsequent emperors, under Vespasian and Titus, but resumed in even stronger form during the reign of Domitian from AD 81 to 96. And notice the words of verses 9 and 10. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they shall go. If anyone is to die by the sword they will be killed. And that was certainly true of those who were martyred under these intense times and during these intense times of persecution. These are statements of resolve. These are statements of confidence in God's people. If anyone is to go into captivity they shall go. If anyone is going to be killed by the sword, they will be killed. And this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on part of the saints. And there is teaching in Scripture obviously about Christians' responsibilities under civil powers and civil governments. Christians aren't to resist civil powers. We read that in Romans chapter 13, verse 2. We read that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, with the exception of doing things that are contrary to the will of Christ and to the will of God. But neither are Christians to fear civil powers. It's better to fear God than to fear Rome. It's better to prioritize his will than the will of any human government that opposes his will. Well, let's continue the reading here in Revelation chapter 13. Let's look now at verses 11 through 18. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of God's people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and that number is 666. And so here, we've introduced the first beast. Here is the second beast, the beast that comes from the land. And he's described as one who comes out of the earth. He has two horns like a lamb, and yet he speaks like a dragon. We know that this second beast exercises authority on behalf of the first beast. His objective is to get others to worship the first beast. He performs great signs. He deceives the inhabitants of the earth. He sets up an image of the first beast. He causes worshipers of the first beast to receive a mark, the mark of 666, 666. And without that mark, their livelihood is greatly affected. They're not able to buy or to sell. What's kind of interesting about this second beast is that he bears some resemblance to the Lamb. Jesus, in as we've already seen in Revelation chapter 4, is described as a lamb. But the difference is that this isn't true religion. This is false religion. Because you see the end of verse 11 that he had two horns like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon. And so something that appears to be good, something that appears almost like the lamb, and yet when he speaks with a voice of the dragon. The beast poses as something good, but is actually an evil entity. And the evidence of its evil is that it enforces the worship of the first beast. And so, as we've said in our introductory lesson, the second beast represents the cult of emperor worship. It refers to all the officials, all the deputies who promoted the worship of Caesar as Lord. During this particular time in history, there were huge temples that were erected to Roman emperors, and people had to make that confession. They had to bow their knee. They had to say that Caesar was Lord or be killed. And in fact, in the ruins of ancient Ephesus today, you can find ruins to the temples of Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, and idols were set up that represented various Roman emperors. And notice some of the tactics that are used. In verse 13, it performed great signs, even caused fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of people. In verse 15, it says that the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship that image to be killed. And in verses 16 and 17, it forced people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. And so miraculous signs, verse 13, the power or the ability to give the idol power to talk, at least seemingly, in verse 15, discrimination against those who refuse to worship the first beast. There was an article back in 1984 in the Journal of Biblical Literature entitled Signs and Wonders in the Imperial Cult. And it addressed this portion of Revelation chapter 13 specifically. And what was interesting was that it said that the Romans were pretty ingenuous in their efforts to deceive people during this particular time, even to the point of having very sophisticated magic tricks that included impressive lighting displays. Obviously, they didn't have anything other than oil lamps and that sort of thing, but they would use that lighting in a way so as to deceive people that these idols actually had magical powers, and also even used ventriloquism to make it appear as though the idols were speaking to people, which is right in line with what is said in verse 15. Well, when their deceit didn't work, then they resorted to strong-arm tactics, and that's what's described in verse 15. So that those who wouldn't worship the emperor, they would be discriminated against. Almost no legal transaction was possible without the stamp of the emperor. And so wills, marriage settlements, transferring property, buying and selling, and to get that stamp, a person had to worship, had to pay homage to the emperor. And so you see the dilemma and the bind that Christians were in during that time. Do we worship Caesar as Lord and thus sacrifice our own livelihood? Or do we remain faithful and remain true to Jesus? And the persecution that they faced ranged from discrimination all the way to death. Now, some estimates say as many as 6 million Christians were killed during the 200 years of the Roman persecution, and horrible means of death, too. Some were eaten by wild animals in front of crowds. Some were burned at the stake. Some were tied to the wheels of chariots and paraded through the streets as they were rolled across cobblestone roads. Persecution began under Nero, subsided some under Vespasian and Titus, but resumed in full force during the reign of Domitian. But the irony in all this is that Satan didn't get the outcome that he was seeking. His persecution actually helped to establish Christianity, not to see its end, to see its demise. I had a preacher one time that told me that, Keith, the problem with the church today is no one's killing Christians anymore. And his point was that we live in a time of relative ease and comfort, and certainly there are things that certainly we face some degree, some measure of persecution. We sometimes face the disdain of others, and others look down upon us because of our faith, because of our convictions. But it hasn't risen to the level that Christians living during the reign of Domitian under the Roman Empire, our persecution certainly hasn't risen to the level of the things that they faced during that particular time. You wonder what would happen if we were placed under such intense persecution. Because when this particular persecution was over, Christianity was stronger than it was when this persecution began. Eventually, Roman Emperor Constantine professed faith in Christ. Now, that's pretty remarkable when you think about some of these other emperors and their history. Well, before we leave chapter 13, let's talk about the number of the beast, because there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of speculation about this number 666, and all kinds of interpretations have been offered. Some have said that this is an encoded number on biochips that the government is secretly implanting in U.S. citizens. Some have said that somehow, and they've done these different machinations and said this somehow corresponds to world leaders like Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or even some U.S. president. But none of those interpretations would have had any relevance to the first century audience of the book of Revelation. And this part's a little bit complicated, but some commentators I've read believe that there was some numeric value that does correspond directly to a historical figure, namely to Nero, they say. And the reasoning they use is this, that the ancient people, one of the things that they enjoyed doing was playing with numbers and letters and their value. And there was one system under which every letter of the Greek alphabet had a numeric value. And so 1 through 9, then the numbers 1 through 9 corresponded with the first 9 letters, alpha through iota. Starting with iota and going through kappa, those letters in the Greek alphabet corresponded with different multiples of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. And then starting with rho and going through omega, those corresponded with multiples of 100, 200, 300. And in fact, there's some ancient graffiti that's been uncovered in the city of Pompeii where it says, "I love her whose number is 545." And so whoever, the young man who wrote that graffiti, whoever he was in love with, he had taken her name, the letters in her name, and it came out under this particular system to 545. And so if you use that system and apply it to Nero Caesar, actually not even to that, but to a variant spelling of Nero Caesar, it would actually come out to 666. Well, you could take that for what it's worth. But I think more plausibly, and as we've seen, especially with our study of numbers in the book of Revelation, the number 6 is symbolic of man's number. Man falling short of God's intentions, falling short of God's purposes. And you put that number 6 in triplicate form and you get 666, 666. Someone who not only falls short of God's purposes, but someone who's evil. And so whatever that 666 represents, it had to be something that would make sense to these first readers who knew nothing about Hitler or Osama bin Laden or some of the other people that sometimes we try to apply that number to. Well, let's look at chapter 14 before we close our study today. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 5. Then I looked, and standing before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like the peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of a harpist playing the harps, and they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth, those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remain virgins. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths, and they were blameless. And so, again, here we read of the 144,000. This is the church triumphant. In other words, these are those that are now in heaven with Jesus. And so we're transported there, and we see them standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is representative of heaven. Literally, Mount Zion was one of the hills on which Jerusalem was built. And Zion is used different ways in Scripture, but the overall meaning is the dwelling place or the habitation of God. Initially, Mount Zion was a stronghold of Jerusalem. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 7. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. And so later, Zion is spiritualized, and it's spiritualized to refer to heaven. And we see that in the book of Hebrews. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and 23. But you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And so that's what we're talking about when we sing, we're marching to Zion, glorious, glorious Zion. We're talking about the spiritual meaning of Zion, now the dwelling place, the habitation, the fortress of God. These 144,000 are in heaven. God's name is written on their foreheads. That's a contrast to those who had the mark of the beast on their foreheads in chapter 13, verses 6 and 7, or 16 and 17. And in verse 2, John hears sound like rushing water and thunder and harps, and taken together, this is just a picture of power and majesty and holiness. In verse 3, they're singing a new song, one that only the redeemed could sing. And the phrase a new song was a common phrase in the Old Testament to refer to acts of deliverance from God. People would burst forth in song, and they would sing a new song, a song of deliverance. And notice the characteristics of these 144,000 in heaven. They're redeemed. What does the word redeem mean? Well, it means that someone's freedom has been purchased. They've been ransomed. They've been bought back, and they're pure. It says in verse 4, and these are those that did not defile themselves with women. And this might seem out of context until you think back to the letters to the churches that we studied in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation. And one of the warnings that was given in those letters was against false teaching. And one of the things that the false teachers tried to entice people to do was to seduce them into sexual immorality. And so we see the purity of those who refuse to participate in those things. And these 144,000, they are those that follow the Lamb. Wherever he goes, they go. No lie has been found in their mouths. In other words, they refuse to confess Caesar as Lord, because that would be a lie. That would be untruthful. And they're not about that. They don't do those things. They don't say those things. So those are the characteristics. Let's read now chapter 14, starting in verse 6. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who lived on earth. To every nation, tribe, language, and people, he said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. A second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink of the maddening wine of her adulteries. And then a third angel followed and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their foreheads or on their hand, they too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured out in full strength in the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, for anyone who receives the mark or its name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of God's people who keep his commands to remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. And so here we read about three more angels with three messages. The first angel essentially says, worship God, for the hour of judgment has come. The second angel makes this announcement. Fallen is Babylon the Great. And remember, Babylon is code for Rome. Babylon persecuted God's people in the Old Testament. Rome is the current power persecuting God's people. And the third angel issues a warning to those who worship the beast and his image. In other words, those who succumb to emperor worship, that they are going to suffer eternal consequences. There's a warning here for those who worship Caesar, but a promise to those who worship Christ. And that's announced. An angelic voice coming from heaven confirms the words of this angel in verse 13. Write this, blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor and their deeds will follow them. And so the message is, you could choose Caesar over Christ, but you're going to pay the consequences of that eternally. Now, hopefully we never find ourselves in that position, in that situation, but if we're given a choice between saving our lives or renouncing our faith, we need to muster the courage to confess our faith and even choose that over our own lives. Because that profession of faith is everything. Look at Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels. Our profession of faith is everything. And there's a paradoxical statement there in verse 35 that would have been very relevant for those in the dilemma of having to worship Caesar as Lord or profess their faith in Christ. And that paradoxical statement is, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. If we're ashamed of Jesus and his words, he'll be ashamed of us when he comes again. Look at now at Revelation 14, picking up at verse 14 through the end of the chapter. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because the grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city. The blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of 1,600 stadia. And so we're seeing in chapter 14 the end of the 1,260 days, or the 42 months, or the 3.5 years. But however you state it, this time of persecution is coming to an end. Remember the question of the martyrs: how long, O Lord, to avenge our blood and judge the inhabitants of the earth? And the fall of the persecutor is described as a time of a reaping, that Jesus is seated on a cloud with a sharp sickle. An angel comes from the temple and tells him that the harvest has come. So he swings the sickle over the whole earth, and the earth is harvested. And two more angels appear. One has a sickle, also has a sickle. He comes from the temple. Another has charge over fire. He comes from the altar. And they gather grapes to throw into God's winepress. But it's not wine that comes out, it's blood that comes out. And what we see is a harvest from the perspective of the faithful. And then verses 17 through 20, we see it from the perspective of the unfaithful. Is Judgment Day, is that going to be a day of mourning, or is that going to be a day of rejoicing? Well, it really depends on what side you're on. God's judgment on the Roman Empire wasn't going to be pretty. Verse 20 says that the blood flowed out of that press, 1,500 stadia. In modern terms, it's about 5 foot high for a distance of 200 miles. And so the martyr's question is now being answered, and will continue to get an answer in the next several chapters. And what we're seeing is the ultimate victory, the ultimate triumph of God. We do all this study and in-depth analysis of the book of Revelation, but I really like the simplicity of Randy Harris's summary of the book of Revelation. He simply says the message of God's going to win. Pick a side. Don't be stupid. And I think that's a pretty good summary of this book of the Bible. God's going to win. And that's what we're seeing as we study the pages of the book of Revelation. God's victory is assured. God is going to win. We need to determine whose side we're on, who we're going to align ourselves with. And we need to be smart when we make that particular choice. We'll continue in chapter 15 in the 6th lesson. Revelation next time. Thanks for joining us.